So holding that ISO and moving this back dial on the 750 back and forth, it goes down to a low of 0.0, I guess mine goes down to 0.10, which you rarely ever need to go down to. I usually keep mine no less than 100, and it can go all the way up to like some crazy number. Oh, it jumps into high. 12,800. That's very, very, very sensitive. And so this number, the higher that it is, the less light you need. But that means that it's very bright in your camera. This also means a lot of grain, so that kind of super textured parts of your images, and they also call it JPEG artifact. So this high setting would be for like weddings that have no light. Maybe they're on the dance floor dancing and the lights are off and it's just a single spotlight and you're trying to capture it. That's what this setting would be. Nighttime photography, with not a lot of light, you're trying to capture something, you would bump the ISO up super, super high, but you also get a ton of grain. But for babies, of course, we're never going to set that high because that's ridiculous. It's just showing you the maximum that it could do. So for babies, even in natural light, you could set it to about 320 all the way up to about 1,000 is a maximum that you would need to go for natural light. The higher the number, the brighter the image. The lower the number, the less light that you get. So down here at 200, natural light would not be a ton of light. It would not be a super bright picture. So for your settings, sorry, I'm going to move this right quick. I would definitely, if you're doing natural light, which I feel like that's what you'd be doing, you would need to set your camera settings. If you're choosing to do manual, which I would suggest, just play with it, because the more that you play with it, the more you learn about it. And it's just trial and error. This is all trial and error. I would start at about these settings. You would bump up this number here, which is the ISO. If you need a brighter image, then you will make it 200, 250, 320, so on and so forth. So this makes the image brighter. This also can make the image brighter, but you rarely will need to change your f-stop, your shutter speed, not your f-stop, your shutter speed. This you can probably keep the same. You probably would rarely need to change it. This is the other number that you can change to make the image brighter or not. So the lower the number, the brighter the image. The higher the number, the darker the image. So take, for instance, you have a white baby on a white background with a lot of light. This would be, you can bump this up to, F4. You can turn this down. Sorry, I have to press that ISO down there. This could go down to like 120, 125th. This could be 125, or you can leave it at 160. A lot of times when I'm shooting, I'm moving my aperture or I'm moving my ISO. Shutter speed stays the same because of the type of strobe that I'm using. You rarely have to change it, but for natural light, those are the two that you would change back and forth. But having said all of that, because you're in auto mode, going back to auto, auto does it all for you. So whatever you're setting, you can tell as I'm moving, it's changing that shutter speed. That's what it's changing for me. It's evaluating. See, okay, so now I'm pointing it at my desk lamp, and it changed the shutter speed to 250. Changed it to f8, so now it is a smaller aperture. The shutter speed's faster, it's going back and forth. Then as I rotate, now we're down to 60th of a shutter speed. now it's super slow. But what I can do, let me see if it'll let me do this. Ah! I almost dropped my camera. I'm changing the shutter, the ISO. So I changed the ISO to 250 to see what it would do in auto, and it's about the same. I haven't used auto in a very long time. So my office in here at home is fairly dark. I don't have a ton of natural light because I have the curtains closed and the blinds closed, and I am, I have nothing but this desk lamp going. So that's why the shutter speed is so slow. So you would tend to get a lot of blur with the actual subject. It would be hard to capture, say, that light to be sharp because the shutter speed is so slow. You'd have to have a very steady hand or use a tripod. So that just shows you in auto mode what my camera is doing. So sometimes you can take your camera outside, put it in auto, and just do this exact thing. Swing it around, focus at the sun, focus at the dirt, focus at concrete, and see how your camera changes. And you'll be able to see what it's looking for. So the biggest things to remember, sorry, I'm being unsteady here, is just kind of going back over these one more time so you get an understanding. This is your shutter speed. It is how quickly or how slowly your shutter opens and closes. The smaller the number, the slower your shutter opens, the more blur or your subject would be less in focus. It requires a tripod or an extremely steady hand at a lower number. It also requires a lot more light, so that means that you need a aperture that is super low or a shutter speed that is very, very high. I mean, an ISO that's very high. The higher the number, so you're getting up shutter speed 500 or plus, that is making the shutter open and close very quickly, so it captures action. Think of sports. Sports photographers have their their shutter speeds very, very high because they're capturing a player running. Mid-run, they want it sharp, so the shutter speed's going to be extremely high, but then they have to compensate by changing their f-stop to be very low, so a lower number in the 1.8, 2.0, and their ISO, depending on how much light they have. A stadium has a ton of light, so they don't need a very high ISO. They might have their ISO at maybe 1,000, maybe 1250. And then the f-stop, the smaller the number, that's your aperture. The smaller the number, the more wide open your lens opens up, the more light it captures. The higher the number, so f8, f11, f16, f22, the smaller the opening of your lens, the less light it captures, but it also makes your background more in focus. Versus a smaller number, your background is more blurry, so less in focus. And then your ISO is a number, the smaller the number, the less light it gets. The higher the number, the more light it is, but you also get to a point of having more grain. It's the sensitivity that your sensor uses the light to capture the image with. So these three numbers work in conjunction with each other. It's called the exposure triangle. You move one, you have to move the other two. So what I did starting out is I kept my ISO and my shutter speed at one number. So maybe I left it at, oh, I have it in auto. Sorry, let me move it back to manual. So I kept my shutter speed at 160, and maybe I kept my ISO at 250. And then I started taking pictures, moving my aperture to different numbers. And so I would start at a super low number, 1.8. I'd take a picture. I'd move it up to like 2.5, take a picture. You know, I'd move it to f4, take a picture, so on and so forth. And then you will start to get an idea of what your how changing your aperture affects your image. And then I went back and I would keep my aperture at like 2.0, and then I would move my ISO, changing my ISO numbers. And then I would do that. I'd start at a very low number and I'd go all the way up and see how my image was affected. And then I would put this at a certain number, and then I'd start messing with my shutter speed. So it's just figuring out how the numbers affect each other and what they do to your image. And once you learn how each of them conjunct with each other, it's very easy to make appropriate adjustments. And it takes time. It is muscle memory. It is knowing what kind of subject you have. A light subject, a dark subject, a light background, a dark background, those types of things. And it is just practicing. That's really all it comes down to.